The photo you see here took me 16 months to get. I spent the first 13 months sitting in a hole in the ground next to a water hole, and the last 3 months I lay in the water to get the shot. You know, when I look at that photo, I do very often find myself sort of daydreaming about those days, you know. Sort of as a wildlife photographer, those were really, really great days for me. It was an incredibly exciting time of my career. And I always kind of thought in the back of my mind, you know, that those cubs had probably not survived. But I wonder sort of, you know, if perhaps maybe one or two of them did. I was sent a documentary on lions, filmed and produced by the Kenyan documentary maker Anna Campbell. And her documentary was about lions in the South Rift Valley of Kenya, and that is the area where I took this photograph. So I began to wonder if perhaps Anna could help me answer the question as to whether any of my young cubs survived.
When I got Greg's emails, I tried to calculate the chances of finding this particular pride in roughly 45,000 hectares of free-ranging lion territory. And our chances weren't particularly high. But Greg's enthusiasm was so contagious that I found 10 days where I could take him down to Shompole and try and find him some answers.
Before I knew it, Anna Campbell and I were in a Land Rover bouncing down into the Rift Valley, down towards a small, hot, dusty town called Magadi and beyond, looking for my lion cubs. As soon as we got there, I just wanted to get back to my waterhole, because that's where I'd spent 16 months, in that exact spot, just witnessing and observing and photographing. So the first thing we did was we drove straight across the Rift Valley floor and found my tiny waterhole. To be honest, I was a little embarrassed at first, I think, when we found the waterhole, because it looks like a really small, sort of innocuous, even sterile, tiny puddle of water. But that's not how I remember it. I remember it as having just given me sort of day after day of incredible experiences. But when I stood there with Anna, it just looked like a little puddle on the floor of the Rift Valley. And I try to sort of make it sound exciting and explain to her where the lions drank and how I got my shot. But at the time, there were no animals around. So I do think that Anna, you know, was starting to wonder if I was perhaps slightly mad.
With only 10 days to work with, I knew we needed some help. So I decided to head straight to see Guy Weston and his team, who run a lion research project and have collected an impressive database of lions within the Shompole area.
Originally, sort of 7 years ago, my wife and I were running a community project, and that's how we came to be in this part of Africa. And the guy that used to do our laundry, a chap called Makinyo, we found him on the way to the research center, which was great. Makinyo now works as a research assistant for the Rebuilding the Pride project. So we bundled him into the car and we took him with us to the research center. Well, the meeting was very interesting because I basically put up my lioness with the 7 cubs photograph, and Guy Weston, who heads the Rebuilding the Pride project, pulled up the photographs that he's got of the now full-grown lions and lionesses in the area. And basically what we were trying to do was to look at the top line of the whiskers, because that pattern is unique to every individual. Guy sort of you know, was very diplomatic, and he said to me that, look, he really likes my lion photo, but it's not the type of photograph that a lion researcher would take, because it was only one side of most of the cubs' faces. But where it got very interesting for me was when we showed the photograph to Makinyo. Now, Makinyo has been following these lions for the last couple of years, and when I was here 7 years ago, he knew my lioness and the 7 cubs, And as soon as he saw the photograph, he immediately pointed to the third cub from the left, and he shouted the name Nyamunak. And he clearly, I sort of recognized and identified this lion, but not by the whisker pattern. He pointed straight at her ear. And my cub has a very elongated ear, and the female that the lion researchers now call Namunak also has a very elongated ear.
Honestly, I couldn't believe it, that we'd found a potential match so quickly, and that it was one of the 5 of the collared lions that Guy and his team were researching. So I immediately asked Guy what Namunyak's last coordinates were, and he confirmed that her and her pride were in and around Greg's waterhole. So we beelined back to the waterhole, as that was our best chance of finding her, and we talked tactics.
The original plan was for Anna to sit in the vegetation behind me and to then film this project. But when we got to the waterhole, I realized, not only has the vegetation changed, but of course the last time I did this project, we had 16 months. And one of the, major factors why this photograph was possible is because I was sitting in the water and the water was masking my scent. But of course, having Anna now sitting on dry land, I was pretty much convinced that the lions would smell her and would not drink. So I decided before the time that I was going to try to get Anna to sit in the water. Now, there are not many people in the world that would do that. I've been told repeatedly that I'm crazy. And I sort of mentioned it to Anna, and she sort of was totally cool with it, which surprised me somewhat, but we jumped into the water together. It was exactly like I remembered it, the smell of the mud, the tiny whirligig beetles swimming around my legs, the water snails climbing up my arms and sitting under my watch strap. There was just a plethora of life, and especially the bird life, that is something that I really remember from the first project. There are just birds everywhere. I mean, we had grey-headed kingfishers diving and drinking right next to us. The one evening we had slender-tailed nightjars flying in, sort of in that dusk light and dipping and drinking right beside us. And I was really grateful because I've spoken about that time many times, and I've related, to people the wonderful things that I managed to see and experience. But now for the first time I had someone in the water with me, and that was quite special to be able to share my little patch of Africa with someone else, and for them to also realize how much life this tiny body of water sustains. A lot of similar species did show up, like a bushbuck the one evening, but nothing sort of took me back to the original project like seeing 2 Egyptian geese on the edge of the water. During the original project, the only constant sort of in my life at the time was my wife and this pair of Egyptian geese that had claimed this little waterhole as their own. So during the first sort of 16 months, I watched these geese mate. I watched them build a nest, I watched them incubate the eggs, the young little goslings used to swim around me. I then watched those goslings grow up, and I then watched them be chased off by their parents. And seeing these 2 geese on the side of the water really just warmed my heart, and I just felt like I was home.
I was sat just behind Greg and watched him totally fixated on these geese, and then I remembered him telling me about the ones that he saw 7 years ago. Egyptian geese have a lifespan of roughly 10 years, and they're very territorial, so the likelihood of these being the same geese that swam around him 7 years ago is very high. And every time they came to the water, he wouldn't flinch.
We kind of reverted to a very similar timetable that I had during the original project. So we would wake up at sort of 4:30, drive across the floor of the Rift Valley. The vehicle would then drop us off, and from about first light, so from about 6 in the morning through to 9, sometimes 10, we sat and waited in the water. and then again in the afternoon from about 4 o'clock or 3:30 to 6 p.m. But what we then realized was that the chances of the lion drinking grow exponentially the later into the day it gets, because lions are chiefly nocturnal, and these lions in Masai land are more nocturnal than lions in other parts of Africa. So I spoke to Anna. Again, I was surprised when she agreed that we could sit in the water until 7 o'clock in the evening, which is basically until it's almost pitch dark. But for that last hour from 6 to 7, our chances were the best of getting the lions drinking again.
On the fourth morning, we arrived to find several different lion footprints around the waterhole. So I asked Losram, who is a Maasai researcher down there, if he could try and help us track and identify whose pride had been drinking. We followed the tracks to a pride with a kill, and Greg took some photos but couldn't find a match, and Naminyak wasn't there.
After day 7 of sitting in our waterhole, I began to panic because we only had 3 days left, and I decided that we should change our strategy. Kindly ask Guy Weston if he would come out with us early in the morning and, using her radio collar, try and locate her exact position. Heard the growls of tiny cubs, which was incredibly exciting, because this now meant that Naminyak had cubs of her own, which meant that my cubs in my original photograph now had cubs.
It was an amazing morning. Sat watching these cubs play and Greg's expression, and then we discovered that Naminyak and her cubs had just been feeding, so it was likely that they were going to find somewhere to drink. And Guy and I knew of a really small patch of water nearby, so we took our chances and drove ahead of the pride to this water in hope that they would come.
As soon as we got to this puddle of water, I jumped out the car and I dove into the water. And I felt a little sheepish because the water was only about 5 centimeters deep. So, you know, I was a little bit embarrassed, but I knew that those lions could arrive any time to drink. The researchers are in their vehicle and they're scouting the bush. And I hear one of them whisper to me that she's coming. And of course, at that point, my heart starts to beat and I feel my adrenaline starting to flow. And what happened the first time was I got the shakes, because your body fills with adrenaline and that adrenaline's got nowhere to go. And it manifests in an uncontrollable shaking of the hands. So I knew that that potentially could happen. So I immediately started to calm myself and just kind of looked away again and just told myself to relax. And I checked my camera settings and I just kind of calmly and patiently waited for her to arrive. And then the first thing I saw while I was waiting was I saw this little cub pop out from next to this little pool of water and sort of pop out of this rank grass. The cubs always get to the water first, and I knew it might take Mom a couple of minutes before she got there. So this was my chance to photograph a cub, and it was just an absolutely incredible moment. I slowly tried to sort of crawl forward to try and get the best shot I could, because there was a piece of grass between myself and the cubs. And then eventually the lioness appeared as well. Unlike my first shot that I took 7 years ago, she immediately saw me and her ears pricked forward and she stared straight at me. And I managed to get a shot of her with one of the little cubs in the foreground. And that was really, I think, exactly what I'd come for. Something different happened this time. She then crouched sort of low down And I've seen lions crouch like that when they hunt antelope before, and she slinked off into the grass. And I then realized that I'd now crossed a boundary that I shouldn't have, and that this was uncharted territory for me. And basically I wanted to get back to the vehicle incredibly quickly. But again, experience had taught me not to jump up, because if I jumped up, I would have then asserted myself as a human being. So I had to wiggle backwards through the mud as fast as possible to the vehicle.
We didn't want to stop the pride from drinking, so we quickly left the watering hole and drove to a clearing where Greg could get out and dry off. And it only really hit us then how much those few moments in the water meant to Greg, and he just wore this massive grin. The reality of how Greg got his original photographs in his watering hole with no support vehicle, no one in sight, hit me, and that is one ballsy photographer.
There are lots of bad news sort of conservation stories, and for me this story is so incredibly positive. To first of all have found a place in Africa where man and beast still coexist, you know, like we always did for hundreds and hundreds of years, and to be able to go back 7 years later and to find, you know, man and beast still coexisting and still both thriving is just absolutely incredible for me.
I really think that this trip rekindled Greg's love affair for the area, and he was really interested to learn more about the life around this kind of bubble of peace at his watering hole, where Maasai and wildlife are fighting an uphill battle against threat that development is bringing to the South Rift that will change that area forever. And I think it really motivated him to try and help in some way. He's now taking people down to the South Rift, to his watering hole, to visit the lions and the people and witness this beautiful coexistence down there. He also has released his photography book, which the front cover is the lion pride with Namanyak at the watering hole, and numerous other photographs taken from around Africa that reveal wildlife from a perspective that I've never seen before. So I think the trip became a lot more than Greg expected.